Cold War, moving on from the British Empire, a unipolar world system, to a bipolar world system, the USA and the USSR, capitalism and communism. In terms of elections, key differences: in capitalist countries you have democratic elections. You can vote for whoever you want, anyone can stand for election, you can have any sort of political persuasion that you want. In the USSR, people also voted, but every single candidate was from the Communist Party. So no matter who you vote for, the Communist Party is always in control. A communist dictatorship, exactly the same currently today in China. Industry, privately owned by private companies in the USA and capitalist countries. They keep the profits. Obviously, some tax goes to the government, but they are owned and run by private individuals. In the USSR, in a communist system, they are owned and run by the government. Individual rights, you have rich and you have poor in communist countries, but there is far less of a disparity between rich and poor. Obviously, in communism, particularly in the USSR, you had members of the party, members of the government, the powerful elites, who would have more individual rights than the average person. In the capitalist countries, you have rich and you have poor. It's accepted. Some have more, some have less. So in terms of those key impacts, make sure that you are completing this sheet just to make sure that you're clear about the key differences. So also, there's a little link there. That's the 9-minute Cold War video. Please make sure you watch that. We are literally scratching the surface of the Cold War here. In history, you have whole units on the Cold War, and there is so much more depth to it. So please watch the video, do the reading, get a more thorough understanding of the concepts. So the Cold War essentially started after the Second World War. You had two biggest powers on the victorious Allies' side, the USA and the USSR. Both wanted to spread their sphere of influence. Both wanted to spread their ideology and take advantage of this new world order that the world saw itself in after the war. The USSR wanted to spread communism and did so in Eastern Europe. The countries that it had liberated on its way to defeating Germany, they basically just didn't leave. In the USA, in Western Europe, the USA used money, the Marshall Plan, to try and keep those countries on side and help them rebuild. So, interesting graphic here in terms of the Cold War. Gives you some of the key players down here, the major events, the key causes, and a little timeline as well. I try and have a good look at this and just try and summarize and take from it the key points. In terms of the Cold War, a lot of the big events happened in Germany. The four victorious powers took over Germany at the end of the war. East Germany was run by the USSR, and the British, the French and the Americans shared West Germany. But soon after the war, West Germany had a democratic government installed, and they had free and fair elections, and it was like that until reunification in the early 90s. The British and the Americans, particularly less so the French, still kept a large military presence in West Germany because the Soviets had a large military presence in East Germany, and all countries were paranoid about the other one invading their territory. In a smaller scale, we had the same issues in Berlin. Berlin was split into two sections, East and West, and the Soviets built a wall around West Berlin because it was completely surrounded by communist East Germany, and they allowed certain flight routes and road routes through East Germany so that you could get to West Berlin, but to come off those routes would have been basically suicidal. So we need to think about differences between colonialism and neo-colonialism, because neo-colonialism is very much how the two superpowers in the Cold War maintained their control. Colonialism is what the British and the French, the Spanish, the Dutch did with their empires. They use military force, they impose government systems, they impose laws and language. So it's very much direct control. The colonies did not have their own governments. Neo-colonialism, colonialism, on the other hand, is indirect control. So these countries might have their own governments, but they are governments that are approved by the regime in the USSR or the government in the USA. And we can see examples of this today. Hong Kong is a good example. Even though it supposedly has its own democratically elected government, the people that you can vote for are vetted and approved by the Chinese government in Beijing. So it's indirect control, not direct control. And there's a lot of economic influence in neo-colonialism as well. So in terms of exercising power post-colonial, during the Cold War, after the Second World War, militarily, Britain did try to fight numerous anti-communist wars in Asia to varying degrees of success. Politics, the Marshall Plan that helped European countries to reconstruct. Often in Western democracies, communists would face repression. There were communist political parties in Western democracies, but they were often repressed by the governments in those countries. The IMF and the World Bank giving aid and money to developing countries, but the IMF and the World Bank very much controlled by the Western democracies, particularly the US. So that was another very soft form of influence and control. And of course, culture, language, sport. Spread that around the world, and you're exercising your soft power around different countries. The Berlin Wall collapsed in 1989, 1990, because the Soviet Union simply couldn't maintain control over the Eastern European powers anymore. There had been some popular uprisings in some of the Eastern European countries, which started to make the USSR realize that they were losing their grip on control here. Poland was the first country to really rise up against its communist government. But there are other key reasons too. The economy is the main one. The USSR's economy was nowhere near as big as the European powers and the USA put together. They simply couldn't afford to keep up and maintain control. The arms race bankrupted the USSR, trying to keep up with the military and the nuclear weapons of the Western powers meant that the USSR basically bankrupted itself. Proxy wars, support of Cuba, the invasion of Afghanistan, support of some African governments in terms of communism also spread the USSR too thin. They couldn't maintain that power. Star Wars, the militarization of space, horrendously expensive. The USA could afford it. The USSR couldn't. Okay, the space race is a whole other argument altogether in terms of one of the battlefields, as it were, of the Cold War, which the USSR just couldn't maintain and couldn't win. The USSR invaded Afghanistan in 1979. They tried to occupy it. The US, through the CIA, funded the resistance, the Mujahideen, and again, the USSR had to leave Afghanistan in the mid-80s because they couldn't maintain that war, not only economically but militarily in terms of manpower, and it had a very deep impact on Russian society, which even to today. And of course, the Mujahideen and the resistance gave birth to the likes of people like Osama bin Laden, who of course went on to mastermind 9/11. So different patterns of power bring risk. If you're in a unipolar world like the British Empire, you've got no equal power to push back against you. Okay, the late 90s, early 2000s, the domination of the US. But when we move forward, we look at a multipolar world, there are threats to everyone. There's opposing ways of doing things all over the place. So it brings more risk in terms of how you maintain your power. A quick reminder of the key terminology there in terms of multipolar, bipolar and unipolar. Please do some background reading and look at the videos and everything of the Cold War, because we have only touched the tip of the iceberg so far. And then we'll move on to look at a multipolar world next, looking at the rise of the BRICS, in particular China.